The sun rose over the Napa Valley with an almost aggressive brilliance, casting long, golden fingers across the rolling vineyards of the St. Helena estate. Inside the bridal suite, the air was a thick cocktail of expensive hairspray, peony petals, and the effervescent sting of chilled champagne. For Illyra Vance, this was the finish line of a 2-year marathon. Every crystal flute, every hand-calligraphed place card, and every rose-gold chair had been curated to perfection. Illyra sat before a vanity mirror, her reflection framed by a halo of vanity lights. She looked like the woman she had always dreamed of becoming, a bride. Her skin glowed under the deft brushes of the makeup artist, and her hair was pinned back in an intricate, effortless chignon. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding her, a cold prickle of unease danced at the base of her neck. "Has anyone heard from Sophie?" Illyra asked, her voice steady but her eyes searching the room through the mirror. The room, which had been buzzing with the chatter of 3 other bridesmaids, fell momentarily quiet. Maya, the youngest of the group, paused while sipping her mimosa. "She sent a text to the group chat about 20 minutes ago. Said her morning sickness, her stomach flu was acting up again. She said she's doing her own glam at the hotel to save time and will meet us at the chapel." Illyra frowned. "The stomach flu? She's had that flu on and off for 3 months. I told her she should see a doctor." "You know Sophie," Elena, another bridesmaid, chimed in while adjusting her champagne-colored silk slip dress. "She's a martyr. She probably just didn't want to bring the mood down with her pale face and ginger ale." Illyra tried to swallow the lump in her throat. Sophie had been her North Star since college. They had navigated bad breakups, career shifts, and the death of Illyra's father together. When Julian had proposed on a rooftop in Manhattan, Sophie had been the first person Illyra called even before her own mother. But lately, the North Star had been flickering. Over the last few months, Sophie had become a ghost in Illyra's life. She missed the final dress fitting. She was too tired for the bachelorette weekend in Cabo. When they did speak, Sophie was sharp, distant, and prone to long silences. Illyra had chalked it up to Sophie's high-pressure job in PR and the stress of being a maid of honor for a perfectionist bride. "I've been too demanding," Illyra told herself, staring at her own reflection. "I've been so wrapped up in my own fairy tale that I didn't see my best friend was drowning." Earth to Illyra. The hairstylist laughed, spritzing a final cloud of lacquer. "You're overthinking. It's wedding jitters. Sophie will be there, looking like $1,000,000, crying her eyes out when you walk down that aisle." "You're right," Illyra whispered. "She's just being Sophie." A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A hotel bellhop entered carrying a massive arrangement of white peonies, Illyra's favorite. Tucked into the blooms was a small, cream-colored envelope. "To my beautiful Illyra. I've spent the last 3 years wondering how I got so lucky. Today isn't just a wedding, it's the beginning of the rest of my life. I'm waiting for you at the end of that aisle, and I promise to never let you go. Yours forever, Julian." Illyra pressed the note to her heart. Julian. He was her rock, a man of few words but immense devotion. They had met at a charity gala, and within 6 months, he had dismantled every wall she had ever built. He was kind, successful, and most importantly, he adored her. Or so she believed. As the bridesmaids began to gather their bouquets, Illyra took a moment of solitude. She walked over to the window, looking out at the chapel in the distance. It was an ivy-covered stone building that looked like it had been plucked from the English countryside. She remembered a dinner party 4 months ago. Julian and Sophie had been sitting next to each other, deep in a conversation about some obscure indie film. Illyra had noticed how Julian's hand had brushed against Sophie's arm, a gesture so brief it could have been an accident. But the way Sophie had looked at him, obsidian eyes wide and sparkling, had caused a momentary pang of jealousy in Illyra's chest. She had dismissed it immediately. Sophie is like a sister to him, she had told herself. They're just clothes. Now, in the quiet of the bridal suite, that memory felt heavier. She remembered Sophie's sudden aversion to wine, the same Sophie who could finish a bottle of Chardonnay by herself. She remembered Julian's late nights at the office that coincided with Sophie's emergency work crises. The pieces were there, scattered on the floor of her subconscious like a broken vase. But Ilora was a planner. She liked order. She liked beauty. And she refused to let a few stray thoughts ruin the most expensive, most anticipated day of her life. "Time to get into the dress, Ilora," her mother said, entering the room with a look of misty-eyed pride. The dress was a masterpiece of French lace and silk organza, costing more than a mid-sized sedan. It took 3 people to help Ilora step into it. As the tiny silk-covered buttons were fastened up her spine, Ilora felt the weight of the garment. It was heavy, restrictive, and breathtaking. "You look ethereal," Maya whispered. Ilora looked at herself. The veil was secured, a sheer mist of tulle that trailed 6 feet behind her. She was the picture-perfect bride. But where was her maid of honor? She checked her phone one last time. "Sophie, 10:15 a.m. almost ready. See you at the altar. You won't believe how I look. It's a surprise. Hugs and kisses." The wording was strange. "You won't believe how I look." Usually, the maid of honor would say, "I can't wait to see you." But Sophie had always been a bit theatrical. Ilora tucked the phone away, choosing to interpret the message as a sign that Sophie had found the perfect makeup look to hide her flu. "The vintage Rolls-Royce is outside," her mother announced. "The guests are seated. The music has started. It's time, honey." As Ilora walked out of the suite, the hem of her white dress sweeping across the polished hardwood floors, she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. The Napa sun was still shining, but for a split second, the world felt gray. She brushed it off as nerves, the cold feet everyone joked about. She didn't know that 3 miles away, in a separate hotel room, Sophie was standing before a mirror, zipping up a dress of her own. A dress that wasn't champagne. A dress that wasn't silk. Sophie was wearing white. And as Sophie smoothed the fabric over the slight, unmistakable swell of her abdomen, she didn't look like a woman who was sick. She looked like a woman who was about to go to war. The drive to the chapel was a blur of green vineyards and blue sky. Ilora sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce, her mother clutching her hand. "I just want you to be happy, Ilora," her mother said softly. "Julian is a good man. He'll provide for you. He'll be a good father." "I know, Mom," Ilora replied, though the word father sent a strange jolt through her. She and Julian hadn't really discussed kids in depth yet. Julian always said they had all the time in the world. The car pulled up to the stone chapel. The muffled sound of a string quartet playing Vivaldi drifted through the air. The scent of lavender and expensive perfume greeted her as the door opened. Ilora stepped out, her bridesmaids lining up in front of her. They looked beautiful in their champagne dresses, earthy, warm, and supportive. But the spot directly in front of Ilora, the maid of honor's spot, was vacant. "Where is she?" Ilora whispered to Maya. "She's already inside," Maya hissed back, looking confused. "The coordinator said she slipped in through the side door a minute ago. She said she had to prepare something." Ilora's heart thudded against her ribs. Prepare something? Was it a surprise toast? A special reading? The coordinator signaled the musicians. The tempo shifted. The heavy oak doors at the end of the vestibule creaked open. The guests began to stand. Julian was there. He stood at the altar, looking regal in his charcoal suit. But even from this distance, Ilora could see he was sweating. He was fidgeting with his cufflinks, his eyes darting toward the side entrance of the chapel. Ilora took a deep breath, clutching her bouquet of peonies so hard the stems bruised. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Here we go." She took her first step onto the white runner. The music swelled. The dream was happening. But as she moved forward, she noticed that the guests weren't looking at her. They were looking past her bridesmaids. They were looking at the altar. And then, the screaming started, not a scream of terror, but a collective, horrified gasp that shattered the sanctity of the room. Illyra looked up, and her world stopped. The transition from the vestibule to the main sanctuary was supposed to be the most triumphant moment of Illyra Vance's life. The heavy oak doors, polished to a mirror shine, stood open like the gates to a promised land. As the first notes of Canon in D swelled from the string quartet, a classic, timeless choice, Illyra felt the weight of her veil trailing behind her like a cloud of vapor. Her father was gone, so she walked alone, a choice she had made to signify her strength and her journey toward Julian. But as her silk-clad foot touched the ivory runner, the atmosphere in the chapel didn't just shift, it curdled. The air, previously warm with the scent of lilies and expensive beeswax candles, suddenly felt thin and frigid. Illyra took 3 steps, her eyes fixed on the man at the end of the aisle. Julian looked striking in his charcoal suit, but as Illyra drew closer, she realized he wasn't looking at her with the teary-eyed adoration they had practiced in their shared dreams. He was looking past her. No, he was looking to the side, his jaw unhinged, his eyes wide with a terror that looked like a physical blow. Then, the sound hit her. It wasn't the music. The quartet had faltered, the cello dragging a mournful, dissonant note before the violinists simply stopped playing. In the vacuum of the music, a collective gasp, sharp, jagged, and horrified, rippled through the pews. It started from the back and moved forward, a wave of social electrocution. Illyra slowed her pace, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She followed the gaze of the guests. There, stepping out from the shadows of the side sacristy and walking with a slow, deliberate cadence toward the altar, was Sophie. For a heartbeat, Illyra's brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a glitch in the matrix, a cruel hallucination brought on by wedding day exhaustion. Sophie was there, yes. But she wasn't in the champagne silk dress that Illyra had paid $2,000 for. Sophie was draped in lace. It wasn't just a white dress, it was a wedding gown. It was a floor-length, bone-white creation with an intricate illusion neckline and a flared mermaid skirt that hugged every curve. The lace was delicate, floral, and devastatingly familiar. It was nearly an exact replica of the vintage lace on Illyra's own gown. Sophie had even pinned a sprig of white orchids into her hair, styled in a messy, romantic updo that screamed bride. The audacity of the image was so profound it felt like a sacrilege. In the high society circles of Napa and San Francisco, wearing white to a wedding was a declaration of war. Wearing a bridal gown to your best friend's wedding while acting as her maid of honor was an act of total social and emotional annihilation. Sophie didn't look ashamed. She walked with her head held high, her eyes fixed on Julian with a predatory intensity. She reached the altar before Illyra was even halfway down the aisle. Sophie stepped into the space reserved for the bride, standing directly opposite Julian, mimicking the exact posture Illyra was supposed to take. Sophie. The word was a strangled whisper, barely audible over the rising murmur of 300 guests. Illyra stopped dead in the middle of the aisle. The long train of her dress pooled around her like a spilled secret. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. It was the silence of a car crash in the split second before the glass shatters. Illyra looked at her bridesmaids. Maya was clutching her bouquet so hard the roses were snapping, her face a mask of frozen fury. Elena looked like she was about to faint, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at Sophie's back. Illyra's gaze snapped back to Julian. He was trembling. Not the gentle trembling of a nervous groom, but the violent, visceral shaking of a man who had been caught in a trap he helped build. His skin had turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes darting from Illyra to Sophie, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Julian. Illyra called out again, louder this time. Her voice cracked, echoing off the stone walls of the chapel. What is this? Why is she wearing that? Sophie was the one who turned. She didn't look like the best friend Ilora had shared coffee with every Tuesday for 6 years. She looked like a stranger, someone cold, calculated, and triumphant. She didn't offer an apology. She didn't look embarrassed by the gasps of the aunts and the frantic whispering of the business associates in the pews. Instead, Sophie took a slow, deep breath, her hands drifting down to rest on her midsection. She smoothed the white lace over her stomach, a gesture so deliberate, so laden with meaning, that the air seemed to leave the room entirely. "I'm sorry, Ilora," Sophie said, her voice carrying through the chapel with terrifying clarity. "I told you I had a surprise. I told you I couldn't let you marry him under a lie." Ilora felt the world tilt. The edges of her vision began to blur, turning the beautiful chapel into a smeared oil painting of gold and white. She looked at Julian, desperate for him to say something, to laugh, to tell Sophie she was crazy, to call security, to do anything but stand there like a statue of guilt. "Julian, tell her to change," Ilora pleaded, taking a shaky step forward. "Tell her this is a sick joke. We can still do this. Just tell her to leave." Julian finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, broken thing. "Ilora. We didn't mean for it to happen like this. Not today." The "we" hit Ilora like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The word hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "We. Not she. Not her. We. What do you mean, we?" Ilora's voice was dropping in pitch, the shock beginning to harden into a cold, jagged anger. She looked at Sophie's hand, still resting on her stomach. She looked at the way the white lace stretched slightly over a curve that hadn't been there a month ago. The pieces of the last few months began to click into place with the agonizing precision of a clock. The morning sickness. The flu. The missed fittings. The way Julian had suddenly become obsessed with saving for the future and working late. The way Sophie had looked at him at that dinner party, not with friendship, but with the territorial glare of a woman who owns something. "You're pregnant," Ilora whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that felt like a death sentence. A fresh wave of whispers erupted from the guests. Ilora's mother made a strangled sound from the front row, and her brother, Thomas, stood up as if he were about to charge the altar. But Ilora didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt as if they had been fused to the floor. Sophie took a step toward Ilora, her white dress rustling, a sound that, to Ilora, sounded like a snake moving through dry grass. "It's Julian's, Ilora," Sophie said, her voice devoid of any real remorse. "We been together for 6 months. I tried to stay away, I really did. But you can't fight fate. And I won't let my child grow up with a father who is tied to a woman he doesn't love." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. 6 months. Half a year of Ilora planning centerpieces, choosing hymns, and writing vows, while her fiancé and her best friend were creating a life behind her back. Every "I love you" Julian had whispered in the dark, every glass of wine she had shared with Sophie while venting about wedding stress, it was all a performance. A long, elaborate play where Ilora was the only one who didn't know she was the villain being written out of the script. Julian finally stepped forward, reaching out a hand as if to touch Ilora's arm, but he flinched back before making contact. "Ilora, please. Let's go talk in the vestry. We don't have to do this here, in front of everyone." "In front of everyone." Ilora's laugh was sharp and hysterical, a sound that made the guests flinch. "You're worried about the audience, Julian. You're worried about the optics." She looked at the man she was supposed to spend her life with. In the harsh light of the chapel, he looked small. He looked cowardly. The charcoal suit that had looked so regal moments ago now looked like a costume on a child playing dress up. Then she looked at Sophie. Sophie, who was standing tall in her white lace, radiating a smug, sickening glow. Sophie, who had walked down the aisle not to support the bride, but to replace her. "You wore white," Illyra said, her voice now a low, dangerous hum. She ignored the pregnancy for a moment, focusing on the sheer, petty malice of the wardrobe choice. "You didn't just sleep with him. You didn't just take my life. You wanted to make sure that even in my memories of this day, you would be the one everyone remembers. You wanted to be the bride." Sophie shrugged, a tiny, elegant movement of her shoulders. "I am the bride, Illyra. In every way that matters." Illyra felt the last chord of her restraint snap. The perfect bride, the woman who had spent 2 years being the bigger person, the woman who never raised her voice. She died right there on the ivory runner. She looked down at the bouquet of white peonies in her hands. They were beautiful, expensive, and utterly meaningless. With a slow, deliberate motion, she began to pluck the petals, letting them flutter to the floor like snow. "The flowers were my favorite," Illyra said, her voice eerily calm. "Julian, do you remember telling me that these peonies reminded you of me? Pure. Classic." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Illyra, please." "Shut up, Julian," she snapped, the fire finally breaking through the ice. "Don't you dare use my name. Not today. Not ever again." She turned her gaze to the guests. Her eyes landed on the wedding photographer, a young woman who looked terrified, her camera still raised. "Did you get the shot?" Illyra asked the photographer. "Did you get a picture of the maid of honor in her white dress? Make sure you send that to the tabloids. It's a hell of a story." She then looked at her mother, whose face was buried in her hands, sobbing. She looked at Julian's parents, who were staring at their son with a mixture of shame and bewilderment. The chapel, once a place of sacred vows, had become a theater of the absurd. The air was thick with the scent of a rotting dream. Illyra realized that she was standing in the middle of a ruins. There was no wedding to save. There was no friendship to mend. She turned back to Sophie and Julian, who were now standing close together, a united front of betrayal. They looked like a couple. They looked like a family. And for the first time since the doors had opened, Illyra felt a strange, cold sense of relief. The lie was over. The performance was done. "You want to know what happens next?" Illyra asked, her voice echoing through the silent pews. She didn't wait for an answer. She reached up and unpinned her veil, letting the 6 feet of tulle drop to the floor in a heap of discarded expectations. She began to unfasten the pearl necklace Julian had given her for their 1-year anniversary, the one she had worn as her something new. "This is going to be a very short ceremony," Illyra said, her eyes flashing with a light that Sophie hadn't expected to see. The air in the chapel had turned into something thick and suffocating, like breathing through wet silk. Illyra stood at the epicenter of the wreckage, her white gown, the one she had spent 6 months choosing, now feeling like a shroud. She looked at Julian, then at Sophie, then back at Julian. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the jagged glass of broken promises. 3 months, Julian whispered. His voice was so thin it barely reached the front pews, but in the deathly quiet of the stone chapel, it sounded like a thunderclap. He finally dared to look at Illyra, but his eyes weren't filled with the love he'd promised in his morning note. They were filled with the frantic, pleading desperation of a man drowning in his own choices. "It was only supposed to be one night, Illyra. I was drunk, it was a mistake. We were both stressed about the wedding, and a mistake." Sophie's voice cut through his stammering like a razor. She didn't look like a woman who felt like a mistake. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery and was holding the winning ticket in front of the person who lost it. She turned to face Illyra fully, her hands still resting possessively on her stomach. "Julian, stop lying to her. It wasn't one night. It was dozens. It was the weekends you were scouting locations. It was the nights you were finishing the quarterly reports. We didn't plan for the baby, no, but we didn't stop it from happening either. Sophie stepped closer to Illyra, her white lace hem brushing against Illyra's. 2 brides. 1 aisle. 1 massive, irreparable lie. I'm 12 weeks along, Illyra. I'm having his child. This isn't just some sordid affair you can sweep under the rug of your perfect life. We are a family now. I couldn't let you stand here and say I do to a man who belongs to me and this baby. Illyra felt a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't the searing heat of rage she expected. It was a cold, crystalline clarity. It was as if the betrayal was so massive, so absolute, that her nervous system had simply opted out of feeling the pain in favor of pure, survival mode observation. She looked at Sophie's face, the woman she had called her soul sister. She remembered Sophie holding her hair back when she was sick. She remembered Sophie being the one to catch her when she fainted at her father's funeral. That person was gone. In her place was the stranger in white, a woman who had used her proximity to Illyra's life to dismantle it from the inside out. 12 weeks, Illyra repeated, her voice surprisingly steady. So, while I was sitting in that coffee shop with you, crying about whether we should have the sea bass or the fillet, you were already carrying my fiancé's child. While you were helping me pick out this veil, you were planning which white dress you were going to wear today. Sophie didn't blink. I was protecting you, Illyra. I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment. Illyra's laugh was a sharp, jagged sound that made the guests in the first row flinch. You waited until I was at the altar. You waited until every person we know was watching. You didn't want to protect me, Sophie. You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted the grand entrance. You wanted to steal the light, even if you had to burn the whole house down to do it. Julian reached out again, his hand shaking. Illyra, please. I love you. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could figure it out after the honeymoon. The honeymoon. Illyra looked at him with genuine pity. You were going to take me to Italy, sleep in the same bed as me, and start a marriage while your mistress, my best friend, was growing your child back home? What was the plan, Julian? Were you going to tell me on our first anniversary? Or were you just going to wait until the child started looking like you? A movement in the pews caught Illyra's eye. Her brother, Thomas, was halfway out of his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. Her mother was being held upright by her aunt, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The social shame was one thing, but the visceral cruelty of the act was what was settling into the room now. Illyra realized that everyone was waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the screaming, the crying, the traditional scorned woman performance. Sophie was waiting for it, too. Her chin was tilted up, ready to play the role of the true love who had to endure the crazy ex's wrath. But Illyra refused to give her the satisfaction. She reached up and slowly unhooked the pearl necklace from around her neck. She looked at the necklace, a gift from Julian. Then she looked at the heavy, 5-carat diamond ring on her left hand. It was beautiful. It was also a shackle. You're right, Sophie, Illyra said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. He is yours. You two deserve each other. Truly. She walked toward the small table where the communion elements and the celebratory champagne were set for the post-vow toast. She picked up a crystal flute, filled to the brim with expensive vintage bubbly. A toast, Illyra announced to the silent, terrified room. She held the glass up. To the maid of honor. Who took her title literally. She honored the groom so much she decided to start a family with him before the first hymn was even over. Illyra then twisted the diamond ring off her finger. She didn't throw it at Julian. She didn't drop it on the floor. She dropped it into the champagne glass with a soft clink. The bubbles hissed around the diamond, mocking its brilliance. She walked back to Sophie and handed her the glass. Since you're so fond of taking things that belong to me, Ilora said with a chilling smile, "You can have this, too. Consider it my contribution to the nursery. Or the lawyer fees. You're going to need both." Sophie took the glass instinctively, her smug expression finally flickering into confusion. She looked down at the ring submerged in the booze, then back at Ilora. For the first time, she looked small. She had expected a fight, she hadn't expected to be handed the prize so dismissively. Ilora turned to Julian. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. "Julian," she said softly. "Don't bother coming back to the apartment. I've already sent a text to my brother. By the time you get there, your things will be in the driveway. And the locks? They were changed yesterday. I had a feeling something was off. I just didn't realize how prolific your lies were." Ilora didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on the altar, on the man she thought she knew, and on the woman she had loved like a sister. She began to walk back down the aisle. The walk out was different from the walk in. When she had entered, she was burdened by expectations, by the weight of the veil, by the pressure of a perfect day. Now, as she moved past the rows of guests, she felt lighter with every step. She saw the faces of her friends. Some were crying, some were filming on their phones, some were looking away in shame. She stopped at the row where Julian's parents were sitting. They were good people, people who had welcomed her with open arms. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Ilora said to his mother. "He's your son, and I know you love him. But he isn't the man you raised him to be." Then, she reached the back of the chapel. The coordinator, a woman who looked like she was having a literal heart attack, held the doors open. "The car?" Ilora asked. It's still out front, Miss Vance. But the reception, the caterers are already setting up at the estate." Ilora paused. She looked at the sprawling Napa Valley hills, the sun still shining as if it wasn't the worst day of her life. "Tell the caterers to keep the food coming," Ilora said, her voice ringing with a new kind of authority. "The wedding is cancelled. But the party? The party is just beginning. Only, it's not a wedding reception anymore. It's an end of an era celebration." As Ilora stepped out into the bright California sun, the heavy doors of the chapel swung shut behind her, muffled by the sudden explosion of noise from inside. The guests had finally broken their silence. The shouting had begun. She climbed into the back of the vintage Rolls-Royce. The driver, an older man who had seen everything in his 40 years of service, looked at her through the rear-view mirror. "Where to, Miss Vance?" Ilora leaned back against the leather seats, ripping the lace sleeves off her dress with a satisfying tear. She kicked off her heels and let out a long, shuddering breath. "To the reception, Arthur," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I paid for the open bar, and God knows I'm the only one here who deserves a drink." Behind her, in the distance, she could see Sophie and Julian standing on the steps of the chapel. Sophie was still in her white dress, clutching the champagne glass with the ring in it, looking lost. Julian was standing 2 steps away from her, already looking like a man who realized he had traded a diamond for a handful of ash. Ilora didn't look back again. She had spent her whole life being the perfect daughter, the perfect friend, the perfect bride. Today, she had lost her future, her fiancé, and her best friend. But as the car pulled away, she realized she had finally found herself. The drive from the stone chapel to the St. Helena estate took exactly 12 minutes. For Arthur, the driver, it was a silent journey through the sun-dappled rows of Cabernet grapes. For Ilora, it was the gestation period of a new identity. As the vintage Rolls-Royce glided up the gravel driveway of the estate, the catering staff stood in a neat line, ready to greet the happy couple with trays of crystal Lisa ginger and glasses of sparkling rose. The estate's wedding coordinator, a woman named Genevieve who prided herself on seamless transitions, stepped forward with a practiced, radiant smile. The smile died as the door opened. Illyra stepped out alone. Her hair was still perfectly coiffed, but her veil was gone, and the lace sleeves of her gown had been ripped away, leaving raw, jagged edges at her shoulders. She looked less like a bride and more like a survivor of a very elegant shipwreck. "Miss Vance." Genevieve stammered, her eyes darting to the empty seat in the car. Where is Mr. Sterling?" "The photography schedule is very tight, we need to begin the grand entrance." "The grand entrance is cancelled, Genevieve," Illyra said, her voice like a sheet of ice. "But the bar is officially open. Double the order of everything. If it has alcohol in it, I want it on a tray, and I want those trays moving. Now." "But, the cake cutting? The first dance?" Illyra turned to her, and for a second, Genevieve took a step back. Illyra's eyes were no longer the soft, hopeful hazel of a bride, they were the hard, calculating green of a woman who had just seen her entire future incinerated. "There will be no dance. There will be no cake. There is only a party for a woman who just saved herself $500,000 in divorce settlements," Illyra said. "Go." Illyra marched into the bridal suite, the same room she had left only an hour ago, with a heart full of dreams. She looked at the vanity, at the discarded tissues and the half-empty champagne bottle. She felt a surge of nausea, followed by a terrifyingly cold rush of adrenaline. She reached into the vanity drawer and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty fabric shears that the seamstress had left behind. With a steady hand, she grabbed the hem of her $10,000 French lace gown. Snip. The sound was visceral. She began to cut. She hacked away the heavy, 6-foot train. She sliced the skirt until it hit just above her knees, turning the traditional ball gown into a jagged, avant-garde cocktail dress. She looked in the mirror. She looked dangerous. "Illyra." The door burst open. Maya, Elena, and Thomas, her brother, rushed in. They stopped in their tracks, staring at the floor covered in white silk and lace scraps. "Illyra, what are you doing?" Thomas asked, his face still flushed with the rage he'd been suppressed in the chapel. "I'm dressing for the occasion, Tommy," she replied, kicking a pile of lace aside. She stepped into a pair of gold-studded stilettos she had intended to change into for the late-night dancing. "The bride is dead. Long live the host." "They're here," Elena whispered, looking out the window. "Julian and Sophie. They just pulled up in a taxi. People are staring. Some people are leaving, but most are staying to see what happens." "Good," Illyra said, applying a fresh coat of deep, blood-red lipstick. "I'd hate to give a performance to an empty house." Outside, on the sprawling lawn under the white silk marquees, the atmosphere was surreal. The string quartet had been replaced by the DJ, who, under Illyra's frantic instructions via a bridesmaid, was playing upbeat, aggressive breakup anthems. The guests were huddled in small, frantic groups, whispering behind their hands. When Julian and Sophie appeared at the edge of the lawn, a literal silence followed them. Sophie was still in her white lace dress. She was still clutching the champagne glass that held Illyra's diamond ring. Beside her, Julian looked like a ghost of a man. He was walking with his head down, his shoulders hunched, looking every bit the villain in a story he had once written as a romance. They moved toward the center of the lawn, where the main bar was located. Sophie seemed to be leaning into the role of the martyr now, her hand perpetually on her stomach, her eyes moist. She was looking for sympathy. She found none. "Illyra!" Julian shouted as he saw her emerge from the manor house. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Illyra walked down the stone steps, her new, jagged dress swaying. She held a glass of bourbon in one hand. "No more champagne for her. You have exactly 3 minutes to say whatever lie you've practiced in the taxi, Julian," Illyra said, stopping 10 feet away from them. "Make it good. The guests are bored." "Illyra, please," Julian started, his voice cracking. I know it looks impossible. But Sophie was scared. She's pregnant, and she's high risk. She thought if we didn't do it today, if we didn't force the issue, I would never have the courage to tell you. I love you, Ilora, but I have a responsibility to my child. A responsibility. Ilora took a sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving his. Is that what you call it when you spend 6 months lying to the woman you're supposed to marry? Is that what you call it when you use my money? Because let's be clear, Julian, I paid for the apartment, I paid for the vacations, I paid for your car to fund your little second family. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Most people knew Ilora was successful, but they hadn't realized the extent to which she had been Julian's benefactor. Sophie stepped forward, her face hardening. The sweet best friend mask was slipping. It's not about the money, Ilora. It's about love. Julian chose me. He chose this baby. You can't buy a family. You're right, Sophie, Ilora said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You can't buy a family. But you can buy loyalty. And it turns out, Julian's was remarkably cheap. Ilora looked at the glass in Sophie's hand, the one containing the 5-carat diamond. You're still holding my ring, Ilora pointed out. You gave it to me, Sophie hissed. You said I could have it. I did, Ilora nodded. But I think the guests should see what it looks like when true love meets reality. Ilora turned to the DJ. Music off. In the sudden, jarring silence, Ilora addressed the 300 people standing on the lawn. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice projecting with the clarity of a seasoned executive. Today was supposed to be a celebration of a union. Instead, it's a celebration of a revelation. Julian and Sophie have spent the last 6 months showing us all who they really are. Sophie, my maid of honor, decided that the best way to celebrate our friendship was to sleep with my fiancé and show up today in a wedding dress of her own. She pointed a finger at Sophie's white lace. She wants to be a bride so badly. Let's give her the full experience. Ilora walked over to the nearest waiter and took a tray of red wine. Before anyone could react, she didn't throw it, she poured it, slowly and deliberately, over Sophie's white dress. Sophie screamed as the dark, crimson liquid soaked into the delicate lace, staining the white fabric an ugly, bruised purple. It looked like a wound. There, Ilora said. Now you look exactly how you act. Stained. Julian stepped toward Ilora, his face turning red with anger. That's enough, Ilora. She's pregnant. You can't treat her like that. Oh, Julian, Ilora said, stepping into his space. I haven't even started. Did you tell her about the offshore account? The one my father set up for me that you tried to access last month? Or did you forget to mention that you're not just a cheater, but a failed thief? Julian froze. The color drained from his face once again. He hadn't known Ilora knew. Ilora looked at her brother, Thomas. He nodded and stepped forward with a stack of legal envelopes. In these envelopes, Ilora told the crowd, are the receipts. Literally. The hotel bills Julian charged to our joint account. The jewelry he bought for Sophie using my credit card rewards. I've had a private investigator on this for 48 hours. I just wanted to see if they'd actually have the gall to show up today. She turned back to the disgraced couple. Sophie, keep the ring. It's a blood diamond now. Every time you look at it, I want you to remember that you didn't win a man. You inherited a liar, a coward, and a man who is currently 3 months behind on his car payments. Ilora raised her glass of bourbon to the crowd. To the guests, the food is wagyu, the bar is top shelf, and the DJ has a playlist that will take us until dawn. Please, enjoy the party. It's the most expensive good riddance party in the history of Northern California. She looked at Julian and Sophie one last time. Arthur is waiting at the gate with a taxi for you. I suggest you take it before my brother loses his very thin grip on his temper. Thomas stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest, looking every bit the former college linebacker. Julian took one look at him, grabbed Sophie's arm which was still dripping with red wine and began the long walk of shame back toward the driveway. As they walked away, the DJ dropped the beat. The song was I Will Survive. An hour later, the party was in full swing. People were dancing, eating, and, most importantly, talking. The scandal of the century was the only topic of conversation, and Illyra was the hero of the story. She stood on the balcony of the manor house, looking out at the festivities. Her jagged, short dress fluttered in the evening breeze. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Maya. Are you okay? Her friend asked softly. Illyra looked down at her hands. They were steady. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to manage someone else's ego or fix someone else's mess. I'm more than okay, Maya, Illyra said. I feel like I've been wearing a corset for 3 years and I finally just cut the laces. What are you going to do now? Illyra looked out at the moon rising over the vineyards. I'm going to finish this drink. I'm going to dance with my brother. And tomorrow morning? I'm going to pack a suitcase and go to Paris. I have a honeymoon suite booked, and it would be a shame to let all that French champagne go to waste. She took a final sip of her bourbon and turned back toward the music. She wasn't a bride anymore. She was something much more powerful. She was free. The light in Paris during the early autumn is unlike light anywhere else in the world. It is a soft, buttery gold that seems to polish the limestone buildings and turn the Seine into a ribbon of liquid mercury. Illyra Vance sat at a small, marble-top table at a café in the 6th arrondissement, the steam from her café au lait curling into the crisp morning air. 6 months had passed since the red wine wedding. In that time, the girl who had walked down a Napa Valley aisle with a heart full of naive certainty had vanished. In her place was a woman who moved with a quiet, lethal grace. Illyra was no longer a bride-to-be, she was a woman who had been through the fire and realized she was made of asbestos. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning the morning edition of Le Figaro. She wasn't looking for news of the world. She was looking at a small feature in the lifestyle section titled L'éclat de la liberté, the glow of freedom. It was a profile on her. Following the scandal, Illyra had done the one thing Julian and Sophie never expected, she stayed loud. She hadn't hidden in a hole of shame. Instead, she had taken the viral photos of her jagged, wine-stained, DIY-cut wedding dress and turned them into a brand. She had launched a boutique line of break-up couture high-end, fiercely structured garments for women reclaiming their lives. The end of an era party hadn't just been a farewell to a bad man, it had been the most successful soft launch in the history of the fashion industry. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a notification from a burner account she occasionally used to keep tabs on the legal proceedings back in California. Her brother, Thomas, had been relentless. Julian hadn't just been a cheater, he had been a clumsy embezzler. The private investigator Illyra had hired had struck gold. Julian had been siphoning money from their joint wedding fund, money largely provided by Illyra's late father's estate, to pay off his own mounting gambling debts and to keep Sophie in a lifestyle she couldn't afford on a PR junior's salary. Illyra swiped through a series of legal documents her lawyer had sent. Julian had been forced to declare bankruptcy. The charity he worked for had fired him once the news of his attempted theft of Illyra's trust fund went public. He was now working as a cold call solicitor for a predatory insurance firm, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a dusty suburb of Sacramento, a far cry from the penthouse in Manhattan they had scouted together. But it was the social media update that truly caught her eye. Sophie had posted a photo. Gone was the glowing bride-to-be from the chapel. In the photo, Sophie looked haggard. Her skin was sallow, her dark circles heavy enough to be seen through a filter. She was holding a screaming infant in a cramped, dimly lit kitchen. In the background, Julian was visible, hunched over a laptop with a beer bottle next to him. The caption read, "Family is everything. Even when it's hard. True love survives the storm." Ilora felt a wave of profound, detached pity. It wasn't true love that had kept them together, it was the fact that they had nowhere else to go. They were bound together by the shrapnel of the bomb they had detonated. Julian stayed because he was broke and had a child to support, Sophie stayed because she had nuked every bridge she ever had to be with him. They weren't a family, they were a mutual suicide pact. The white dress Sophie had worn that day, the one stained purple by Ilora's red wine, was probably still sitting in a trash bag somewhere. A permanent reminder that when you steal someone else's life, you inherit their ghosts, too. Ilora? The fabric samples from Lyon have arrived. Ilora looked up as her assistant, a sharp-featured Parisian woman named Camille, approached the table. Camille held a briefcase full of silks and satins. "The scarlet or the midnight blue?" Camille asked, laying the swatches on the marble. "The scarlet," Ilora said, touching the rich, heavy silk. "I want the revenge wrap to be the center of the winter collection. It should look like power. It should look like something you wear when you know you're the most important person in the room." "And the boutique opening tonight?" Camille asked. "The guest list is quite prestigious. Several editors from Vogue have confirmed." "Everything is ready," Ilora replied. She felt a hum of excitement in her chest, a feeling so much more vibrant and real than the hollow anxiety she had felt while planning her wedding. Back then, she had been decorating a cage. Now, she was building a kingdom. She had sold the Napa Estates furniture, the $10,000 dress, what was left of it, and the 5-carat diamond ring. She hadn't actually let Sophie keep the ring. Thomas and the legal team had reclaimed it as part of the settlement for the money Julian had stolen. Ilora had sold the diamond and used the proceeds to fund her first 6 months in Paris. There was a poetic justice in using Julian's symbol of eternal love to buy her freedom from him. As Ilora walked back toward her atelier on the Rue de Rivoli, she caught her reflection in a shop window. She was wearing a tailored black blazer, slim-fit trousers, and her hair was cut into a sharp, chic bob. She looked nothing like the girl in the white lace. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Suddenly, a voice broke her reverie. "Excusez-moi, Ilora." She turned. Standing there was a man she recognized from her college years, Lucien, a French architect who had been an exchange student at her university. He had been the one that got away before Julian had swept her off her feet with his manufactured charm. "Lucien." Ilora smiled, and for the first time in years, the smile reached her eyes. "I saw your face in the magazine this morning," Lucien said, his accent as smooth as aged cognac. "I thought, no, it cannot be the same Ilora. But here you are. You look different. Stronger." "I am different," Ilora said. "A lot has happened since the library in New Haven." "I heard about the incident," Lucien said delicately, stepping closer. "The whole world heard, I think. I am sorry for the pain, but I must say Paris suits you much better than a chapel in California." "I agree," she laughed. "It turns out I'm much better at being an X than I ever would have been at being a MRS." Lucien smiled, his eyes lingering on hers. "I am hosting a small gallery opening tonight. Mostly artists, a few architects. No one in a white dress is allowed. Would you like to come? We could talk about something other than the past." Ilora looked at him, at the genuine warmth in his gaze, the lack of hidden agendas. She thought about her apartment, her thriving business, and the sheer, unadulterated joy of her own company. She didn't need a man to complete her. And that was exactly why she could say yes. "I'd love to," Ilora said. "But I have my own opening first. Why don't you come to mine? I'll show you what happens when you try to ruin a woman who has nothing left to lose." That evening, the Ilora Vance atelier was a swarm of flashing lights and clinking glasses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and success. At the center of the room, on a lone mannequin, was the centerpiece of the collection, the Phoenix. It was a gown made of deep, iridescent red silk. It was structured, fierce, and undeniably beautiful. It didn't look like a wedding dress. It looked like armor. Ilora stood by the window, watching the elite of Paris admire her work. She checked her phone one last time. A final message from her lawyer. Settlement finalized. Julian has signed away all claims. You are officially, legally, and permanently untethered. Congratulations, Ilora. She deleted the message. She deleted the contact. She deleted the last lingering shred of what if. Across the room, Lucian was talking to a journalist, pointing toward Ilora with a look of undisguised admiration. She realized then that Sophie hadn't stolen her husband. Sophie had performed an exorcism. She had cleared out the rot so that Ilora could build something of substance. Sophie was trapped in a white dress that would never be clean. Julian was trapped in a life of his own making, a constant cycle of debt and resentment. But Ilora? Ilora was in Paris. She picked up a glass of real French champagne, not the cheap vintage Julian had tried to serve, and raised it to the room. To the guests, she whispered to herself. And to the girl who wore white. Thank you for showing me that some endings are actually the best kind of beginnings. She turned away from the window, walked into the crowd, and didn't look back at the shadows again. The white lace betrayal was over. The Ilora Vance era had just begun. Years later, people in Napa Valley would still talk about the wedding that never was. They would talk about the woman who poured red wine on her best friend and walked away without a tear. But in Paris, they talked about the woman who redefined the color red. In a small apartment in Sacramento, a faded photograph sat on a dusty shelf. It was a photo of a woman in a white dress, smiling at a man who wasn't looking at her. The lace was stained, the edges were frayed, and the smiles were brittle. The white dress had been a lie. The red wine had been the truth. And the truth, as Ilora Vance discovered, was the only thing that could ever truly set you free.